Welcome to CHSF 2107 Chapter 9 presentation. And I just want to say with this class, I'm going to try to keep these presentations a little bit more concise. In that first term, I was really doing these epic 3-hour presentations, and I'm still going to, be a bit, do my crazy rants and be a bit epic, but I'm going to try to aim to have them a bit shorter, maybe around an hour and a half, or some of them will be a bit longer and some will be a bit shorter, this chapter that's focusing on the physical and cognitive development that happens early in childhood will probably be a bit shorter than most. But the next chapter that's looking at sort of the social and emotional aspect is going to be probably a little bit more regular length. So there'll be a little bit of variation. And then when I get into dreams and ion and those ones, it'll be hard to get me to keep it short, but I'm gonna try. I'm trying to respect the fact that you're all such nice, positive students, and I kind of commented in the last video about making them shorter, and a couple of you responded to that and were just made nice comments that you enjoy the videos, and but shorter's not the worst thing in the world either, because we're all busy people, and I want to keep these concise. And it's oh, Mike, good job making concise videos. Start with a super long rant, but I love you. Hope you're doing well. Welcome. Grab coffee or something, and let's get into this early adulthood physical and cognitive development. This is an idea that I want to think about, especially in relation to our current situation, right? Especially in relation to this very bizarre social reality that we're all dealing with right now. And so Erickson had this idea that for people in their early adulthood, one of the biggest challenges you're dealing with is how you fit into your world socially, and especially at the level of intimacy and at deep personal relationships, and who are you going to spend your time with. And I mean that both at the sort of romantic level and also at the friendship level, and also at the people you're going to work around. And it's these people are going to have a disproportional influence on your whole experience of your life, and it's not everyone influences you the same amount, as we all know, right? But this idea of Erickson says, our ability to establish intimacy becomes the goal, right? So, and he defined intimacy very specifically, and he defined isolation very specifically, and I want to talk about that because it doesn't just mean having a boyfriend or girlfriend or not, because he thought that, for example, intimacy meant very specifically this ability to engage in a supportive, affectionate relationship. So to be in a high quality relationship with someone else, but to be able to do it in a way that doesn't sacrifice that identity that you just developed in the stage before, right? So if you remember back to the last presentation, and I was talking about how one of the big things in adolescent development is around identity, right? And it's okay, so now can you take that idea of who you are and form adult relationships with people that's not one person sacrificing who they are for the other, but that's actually both people engaged in a supportive, affectionate relationship without losing their sense of who they are individually, and that's real intimacy, and that's what the goal of your early adult life is, developmentally, in terms of your development. It's okay, great, now you're at this stage where you have the whole world of possibilities in front of you, but one thing's for absolute certain, not all social influences are of equal value and are equal in terms of pushing your life in a positive direction. So there's your challenge, right? Erickson says, here's your crisis, here's your existential, developmental, Herculean challenge. It's can you actually build relationships of high quality? Can you build true, authentic intimacy? So to Erickson, the risk, if you didn't do this correctly, right, the risk of not establishing intimacy is that, bring this mic a bit closer, sorry. the risk is that we might end up getting into a situation where we experience what he referred to as psychological isolation, where we feel like we're not connected with other people, where we don't have authentic, truth-based relationships of trust with people, where we can actually be ourselves and communicate in a way that's not fake. And so to Erickson, you could very much like have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or be around family, or be around people at work, or you could have people in your physical presence and still experience it as psychologically isolating. So it's almost like this psychological value and depth and quality of the relationship as much as it is like having a relationship. The results from relationships, isolation, the feeling of psychological isolation results from relationships that are inadequate, that don't have self-disclosure, right? That don't have that trust of you sharing with me, and that don't have, well, and where the participants in the relationship have unresolved identity crises, right? So you can see how this links to the stage before, and it links to all the stages before, but there's this like very direct relationship between the Ericksonian developmental stages of identity and intimacy, right? Because it's like, if you're going to connect with another person in a meaningful, like the last slide, in like a meaningful, supportive, affectionate way, where you don't lose like your own sense of self, where you're actually in like, you know, like a healthy relationship, where that's a difficult thing. And it's a difficult thing because, well, it requires a lot of trust, and it requires a new sort of layer of identity. Okay, so we're going to talk about this idea today, right? But I think this is an important starting point, that Erickson really said that to understand development in early adulthood, we need to focus on this idea of high quality relationships. That's basically your goal. And we can use all the fancy language in the world. It's like, at the end of the day, if you're able to establish relationships that have psychological depth, quality, where there's truth and authenticity and loyalty and dependability and actual honesty and actual trust, that's linked with all these like developmental and outcome-based advantages. And if you don't, then the risk is, well, not having relationships based on trust and truth, and having relationships that lack that kind of psychological depth and all the psychological byproduct associated with that. So the researcher we're going to be looking at over the, oh, I don't need to wear those, I just sometimes check back and hear how it sounds. I don't know, I hope the sound quality is decent. I know that I have like a bit of a hum in there, but I'm trying to cancel that out. I think it's okay. So Arnett has this idea that Dr. Jeffrey Arnett, that maybe like thinking of sort of the teenage years as being to 19, and then after that you're an adult or whatever, or 8, let's just use 19. It's like, but obviously 18 for some things, right? Like voting or like military service or a whole bunch of things. So his idea is that actually it might be useful to view it as this more emergent thing, right? Emerging meaning like something that sprouts forth. And so like he thought that maybe we view this 17 to 22 age range as this like kind of emerging adulthood, this like kind of specifically unique developmental period where the individual is experimenting with adult options, right? Like that means things like, now maybe you're moving away from home for the first time ever, living away from family, specifically parents, right? Maybe you're supporting yourself more financially, or maybe they're still helping,
but you're having to manage your finances and your personal life and your even just very practical things like food and taking care of groceries and supplies and stuff like that, and gas in your car and getting your oil checked and regular maintenance and stuff like that. And then there's maybe like, I got lost with like the car maintenance piece, but then there's also like the whole idea around maybe you're in romantic relationships for the first time and that whole piece of it, and or maybe things are a little bit more serious in those areas than before, or maybe you even have a child, or maybe like you're living with someone for the first time, so there's that whole like relational aspect. Then there's the whole aspect of like maybe you moved away to go to school, right? So I'm sure if I say like, okay, what, maybe you moved away to go to school, you're away from your family for the first time, you're dating someone new for the first time, kind of first serious relationship, and you're also getting in a scenario where you're under pressure school-wise. I'm sure I just named the situation of at least a few of you, right? And what, without knowing you and without trying to, and just kind of, that's just kind of the humanity of this, situation, right? That Arnett said that this is like kind of common to this age range. And that, yeah, so this is kind of the point, right? That you're kind of in this stage of life where you're being asked to address all these kind of key ideas around like, who are you going to be? Who are you going to be with? Are you going to be with anybody? Are you going to, what kind of social world do you want around you? What about work? What about where you're going to live? What about how you're going to behave, and what habits are you going to do, and what habits aren't you going to do, and what are you going to associate yourself with? And that this is all happening very interestingly sort of at the same time that the part of your brain that is governing all these things like impulse control, right? Like basically the prefrontal cortex, which I have a video coming up about. That the prefrontal cortex isn't fully myelinized, right? The myelinization aspect hasn't fully completed, and we've talked about that already in this course. But basically the idea is like this, the prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain that's governing impulse control, is one of the things that governs a lot of the higher end thinking. Isn't fully developed yet. The emotional center is, so the teenager or the emerging adult is in this situation where they're kind of emotionally and biochemically adult, but still not weighing consequences the same and more impulsive. Yep, that's basically it for that slide. Catch you on the next slide.
The term prefrontal cortex, or PFC, can be used to refer generally to the part of the frontal lobe that is anterior to or in front of the motor cortex. Neuroscientists generally further divide the PFC into subregions, and while there is no clear consensus on what those subregions should be, some common demarcations include the dorsolateral, dorsomedial, ventrolateral, ventromedial, and orbitofrontal regions. The PFC makes up a substantial proportion of the entire brain, and thus is not surprisingly involved in a long list of functions. But it is most commonly associated with executive functions. There isn't a precise definition for the term executive functions, but it generally refers to processes that focus on controlling short-sighted behavior to be able to act with a goal in mind. This may include things like self-control, planning, decision-making, and problem-solving. Because these are complex cognitive functions, it is unlikely any one brain region is solely responsible for them, and more likely they depend on distributed networks of brain regions. Nevertheless, the PFC seems to play a critically important role in executive functions, a hypothesis supported by neuroimaging research and cases where the PFC was damaged and executive functions impaired. Although each of the subregions of the PFC is typically associated with slightly different aspects of cognition, we are not yet at the point where we can confidently assign specific roles to PFC subregions. Most evidence suggests that the executive functions of the PFC are accomplished due to the interaction of these subregions and their communication with other areas outside the PFC. One general model of PFC function is that it receives sensory information about the external world, uses that information to plan responses, and then communicates with other areas of the brain to enact a response, which might involve anything ranging from movement to simply a redirection of attention.
So I just included that last little short video to do an overview of what the prefrontal cortex is, right? That the prefrontal cortex is like this area that's like really involved in this higher end decision making, and the fact that it's not fully developed during this emerging adulthood period is very significant. So Arnett's also saying that there's this way of viewing this potential for positive change during this emerging adult period in people's lives, because there's all these opportunities, right? So I just want to kind of break down this with you, because sometimes in psychology they present things in a model, right? And it looks like it's just a picture or whatever, but really if we talk about it and break it down, there's a lot of information contained in that, and there's a lot of really kind of useful tools for interpreting the complexity of potentially your own situation, right? That you have a lot of opportunities, and a lot of those opportunities, maybe some of them are academic in school, and some of them are work, and some of them are relational, and maybe even romantic, and you're also in these really kind of life-changing potential contexts or environments. Transformational context means like you might be at, say for example, NIPSing, right? You're at university, so you're maybe around, let's pretend this is like more normal times. Maybe you're like around all other people, and even this, right? And even in these times, it's like, it's interesting. You'll always remember that during this weird time in human history, you were a university student, and you were like trying to do your best as a university student during this, right? Which is kind of like the timing and the fortune aspect. And then also during this, it's like, who knows what kind of supports you have in your environment, or if you have mentorship, or if you have adult supports, or if you have people trying to steer you correctly. And that you're at this stage where you're cognitively able to start to exert a lot of strategic executive control over your life, which is an awesome way of saying, like, basically just become a more autonomous decision maker about your own situation. It's like in taking yourself seriously and actually taking ownership over your decisions, and deciding to, take yourself seriously, that you have agency. See, this model is, I'm kind of like just stumbling into each next point, but it's like part of that is just because it's a well-designed model. And that so much of this process and this ability to, develop resilience as you emerge in adulthood, as it's titled, is linked to things like motivation and your aspiration, right? Like your vision, your self-efficacy, your belief in your ability to achieve what you aim at achieving, right? Which is basically self-efficacy, your belief in your ability to achieve what you're trying to achieve in a given context. And that's obviously associated with things like hope, right? So if you believe that you could do things that could change your environment, that's a hopeful thought. That's a transformational thought. Yeah, so this is all like his model for the capacity to change. That you could change, your loved one could change, like things can change. And that there's something, it's not just like we tend to look at things from like what's problematic about it. And yeah, like at this stage in life, there's a lot of problematic aspects, in the sense of like there's a lot of challenges and pressures, and things seem super intense. And I remember, like, I've said this a million times, but I like turned 40 last summer, right? So I'm like an old guy now, but like it doesn't feel like that crazy long ago that I was a university student, and like I remember things feeling very intense and very kind of all or nothing, and very right now. And one of the things about getting older is like things are still intense, but you breathe a bit more. And I think that's maybe, just keep in mind, it's like part of the situation you're in is just that it's a stressful developmental period, and you'll be okay. And it's about sitting down and making a plan and trying to control what you can control, and as much as you can not stress about what you can't. And that's like something I should take my own advice on that sometimes too, but it's like a good overall goal. Right, there's like a famous book back in the day called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and it's like, and then the subtitle was like, and it's mostly small stuff. It's like, even if you just kind of get the title of the book, it's almost worth it. All right.
I think we'd all agree that it takes longer to grow up today than it did in the past. That seems like a fairly uncontroversial statement, and it's backed up by a lot of facts. So in 1960, if we take 1960 as a baseline year, relatively few people got any education beyond high school, if they even finished high school, and 40% of people didn't even get that far. In 1960, the median marriage age was 20 for women and 23 for men. Now it's 27 for women and 29 for men, and still rising. So a lot has changed in the course of the last 50 years in the lives of young people. So much has changed, in fact, that I proposed that it's helpful to think of it as a new life stage of emerging adulthood in between adolescence and young adulthood. But why does it take so long to grow up now, so much longer than in the past? Why is there this new stage of emerging adulthood? There are 4 revolutions that took place in the 1960s and 1970s that set the stage in many ways for the society that we know today, including the new life stage of emerging adulthood. Those 4 revolutions are the technology revolution, the sexual revolution, the women's movement, and the youth movement. First, the technology revolution. The technology revolution is not just iPhones and iPads or even laptops and the internet. Another huge technology revolution of the last 50 years has been the transition from a manufacturing economy to a knowledge economy. We've gotten so good at making things with machines that we no longer need so many people to make them. Most of us are aware of how a lot of jobs in manufacturing have gone to other countries, but it's not just that. Our manufacturing output is actually 6 times greater now than it was in the 1950s, but we're able to do that with only half as many people. So gone are the days where a young man could walk into an automobile factory or a steel plant and make enough money to support not only himself and his family. The new jobs in the knowledge economy are in information and technology and services. And all of those require education beyond high school. Those are where you get the best new jobs in the knowledge economy. You have to have some kind of education beyond high school. And so now more people get more education for longer than ever before. And that pushes everything else out, because most people won't get a stable long-term job for several years after they have finished their education. And most people prefer to wait for marriage and parenthood until after they have a stable job. The second revolution is the sexual revolution. The invention of the birth control pill in 1964, along with other effective methods of contraception, broke the age-old link between sexuality and reproduction for the first time. And in turn, the link between sexuality and marriage became broken for the first time. And so the marriage age started to go steadily up, even as the age of beginning first sexual relations went down. And today, most people begin having sexual relations in their late teens, a decade or more before they enter marriage and parenthood. And so that changes what the late teens and 20s are like. Instead of entering the commitments of marriage and parenthood, people now have this long expanse of a decade or more when they are making and breaking relationships and they're not yet committed to the structure of family life. Number 3 is the women's movement. In 1960, not many people were going to college, but there were twice as many men as women who were college students. Today, 58% of undergraduates are female, only 42% male. And women are also half of the students in med schools, in law schools, in business schools. That has been truly revolutionary. And that has changed how young women think about their lives and plan their lives. It's hard for us even to imagine how much pressure there must have been on a young woman in 1960 to find a man. Because if you didn't, what else were you going to do with your life? There weren't really hardly any professions open to you. And so that was what they were most focused on. Now that they can do anything, they, like young men, want to use most of their 20s for making progress in their education and then in their career. And that has changed entirely what the 20s are like for both young men and young women. And finally, the youth movement. It used to be that adulthood was associated with a lot of good things. It was a source of status and authority. Well, it still is to some extent, but not as much as it used to be. The 60s and 70s changed that with the youth movement. I hope I die before I get old. How many of you are old enough to remember that? Or never trust anyone over 30. Now, those were said somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but only somewhat. There was a truth underlying them, that now adulthood and age became diminished, and it became youth that was venerated. And so young people were no longer in such a hurry to enter adulthood. They preferred to prolong their youth as long as they could and enjoy it while it lasted. So together, those 4 changes have resulted in this new life stage of emerging adulthood. It used to be that people set up the stable structure of an adult life by about age 20. But now it's really true that 30 is the new 20. There's a good reason why that phrase has become popular, because now the transitions that used to happen around age 20 happen closer to age 30 for most people. Instead of moving from adolescence to young adulthood at around age 20, it's adolescence, and then emerging adulthood for most of the 20s, and then the entrance to a stable young adulthood follows. Now, not everybody is delighted to hear about the new life stage of emerging adulthood. Not everybody is happy that it takes longer to grow up than it used to. Quite the contrary. A lot of people are very unhappy about it. And a lot of people think that the fact that young people enter these transitions of a stable adulthood later in the past means there must be something wrong with them. And their parents and grandparents can't help but look at the progress or lack of it of their children and grandchildren toward adult life in their 20s and think, and maybe say, when I was your age, because the timetable has really changed. But I'd like to challenge you, if you think that way today, to try to think about it differently. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them. It takes longer to prepare yourself for the knowledge economy than it did for a manufacturing economy, first of all. So that's not their fault. They are very intently involved in preparing themselves for that world and in trying to find a place in a very complex economy. Secondly, the women's movement has opened up a huge range of opportunities for young women, but that's not a bad thing. I think few of us would view that as a negative development. It's a good thing. It's a great thing. And so having this life stage of emerging adulthood allows both young men and young women to develop their skills for the workplace. There's also that, wouldn't most of us make a better choice of a marriage partner at 28 or 29 or 30 than we would at 19 or 20 or 21? Wouldn't most of us be a better parent if we began that at 30 or 31 rather than 20 or 21? I don't think there's any doubt about that. There's also this. Having the space for emerging adulthood gives young people an unprecedented and unparalleled period of freedom. It's a time when you can do things that you never could do before when you were a kid, and you really won't be able to do later. So if you have a taste for adventure, if you'd like to see what it's like to live in a different part of the country or the world for a while, and maybe do some kind of service project there, this is the time to do it. If you'd like to take a stab at a long shot career like actor or musician or something else in the arts, this is the time to do it. Because later it will be much more difficult when you've made those commitments. Right now, in emerging adulthood, nobody else really depends on you. That's one of the unique things about it. And eventually, people will depend on you, and that will narrow the range of your choices. During emerging adulthood, you have a rare freedom and a brief freedom, and you should make the most of it. I'd like to close by saying to the young people, those who are emerging adults or about to be, don't let anybody stampede you to adulthood before you're ready. Adulthood will still be ready when you are. And a lot of well-meaning people want you to get there as soon as possible. But it's not their life, it's your life. And you should remind them of that if necessary. Adulthood is something that almost everybody enters eventually. And it's a land that once you enter, you can never really go back. So make the most of your emerging adulthood freedom while it lasts. Thank you. Thank you.
So Arnett thought that there are these kind of key features of emerging adulthood, and so just think about this. And even if you're a little bit older, I don't think any of you would be younger than this, but so say if some of you are a bit older, it's still, just think back when you're at this time period, or it's still going to be at least somewhat relative, right? Because this is the thing about developmental stages. It's not like things like identity or intimacy have no relevance to like me at 40, even though I'm not at that stage. It still does. But what Erickson's idea was is that, and you know this by this point in the course, but that certain things are sort of emphasized at different stages. He thought that like this identity exploration and trying to kind of figure out who you are, especially in the areas of romance and work or academics, that's a key piece of it, right? And this is kind of a bridge between the identity and the intimacy stage, right? And a bit of an overlap, and a lot of you are probably in this stage of, and it's a positive thing, it's a normal thing, it's like a very human thing, it's actually universally human, it's a developmental norm that you're at a stage where you're trying to figure out who you are and how you fit into everything. And yeah, and the process of doing that is characterized by a sense of instability, right? It's often like feelings of instability, but also quite literally instability of like things that I kind of mentioned before, of like maybe changing the city that you're in, or like maybe being in relationships that are new, and yeah, residential change, instability in love, or like new kinds of relationships, work changes, school changes, right? It's like it's a lot of change, a lot of things are happening, a lot of movement, a lot of moving parts. It's very self-focused, and I don't mean that in like a negative, critical way, but I mean it in a way of like, if you're like a university student living with some friends going to school, it's like there's not going to be many other times in your life where you're going to have that much of your focused on sort of your own development and maybe like spending social time with people and stuff and working and stuff. But like there is this increased opportunity where there's for socialization and for socializing, I mean, and for stuff like that, right? Now again, obviously this is a massive generalization. If you have kids, if you have others, financial obligations and stuff, this is those are obviously all factors too. That people in this, and remember, keep in mind for this, we're talking about people now 17 to 22, right? Was sort of his range, and that's obviously just a range too. And it's not like this has no relevance for people that are like 16 and 11 months or people that are 23. It still does, but he said that these people, that individuals at this developmental stage can feel like they're in between. They don't feel like they're still teenagers. They feel like they're more mature than that, but they also feel like they're not full-fledged adults yet. Right, so keep in mind this isn't like as the title here, this is like the key features of this, right? If we were to say like what makes this 17 to 22 developmental stage specifically unique, and then this fifth one, that it's sort of this age of possibilities where you could really transform your life, right? Like it's like if we're saying like during this period you might decide who you're gonna be with for the rest of your life. If you make that decision, you might decide the type of career you're gonna do and where you're gonna live. It's like, it's hard to think of, and if you're gonna have maybe kids, it's like, is there 4 bigger life choices in those? And so yeah, the possibility of your life going in different directions is massive. Interesting. It's a very interesting life developmental stage for sure. So in terms of like kind of our society, right? Like we kind of, and I'll just put this quick because this isn't a super deep point necessarily, but it kind of is. It's like talking about how we sort of have social markers of what we expect something like adulthood is, and we expect that like adults should sort of have full-time employment, or you know, unless maybe they're like on maternity or paternity leave or whatever, but or dealing with some kind of illness or specifically, but that they should have some level of economic independence. And notice how I'm using the word should, right? So that's like obviously got like a value marker judgment aspect to it, right? But what we're talking about here is like how society's expectations, that you should be making your own decisions, and you know, depending on the culture, different countries, or I should say kind of different cultures even within those countries, how they view things like marriage as a marker of adulthood varies, but it's significant in a lot of parts of the world for sure. So one thing that I think is really interesting, I just want to pause for a quick second and highlight this, and I know you probably, most of you sort of know this, and all of you know this to like a certain extent, but I just want to kind of clarify this and give some specific language for this, because I want to kind of comment on the relationship between these two very highly related and intertwined disciplines within psychology, right? Because developmental psychology, or the scientific approach that aims to explain how children and adults change over time, a significant proportion of the theories within this discipline are going to be focused early on childhood, because this is the period where most of the change occurs. That this is really focusing on the what. So let's take something like even earlier in the course when we looked at things like why kids tend to start to talk or walk at relatively similar times. If we're talking about why that happens development wise, or why that happens, it gets into this interesting thing of like, well, what do you mean by why? Like why certain human behaviors exist? Like a lot of that question starts to drift into evolutionary psychology and evolution in general, evolutionary science in general. So I want to talk about this idea for a second. Okay, so if developmental psychology is the what, we look at 100,000 children, we notice that, you know, they start to walk and talk and do things at certain times. And we say, well, why is that? Right, so what we see is the developmental psychology kind of tends to be the focus, and again, I'm generalizing. And then I'm going to say on the next slide that the why is that the case tends to be more the realm of evolutionary psychology or evolutionary biology also. So then evolutionary psychology is looking at this from a slightly different angle, right? It's looking at the idea of like, how can certain things, like whether we're talking about memory or perception or language, how does that exist in relation to things like natural selection, right? And so what I have, just, this is kind of like a weird way of doing this, but I have after this slide a video on evolution that I don't believe I've ever shown you in an earlier course, but I think that if you want to skip it, you can. It's roughly 10 minutes, but I think it is actually a pretty awesome video, and it's one of the best descriptions of natural selection and the role of random mutation, and putting language to this idea of what species generation is. Like, what does it mean to have a new species evolve? So it's an awesome video. Evolutionary psychology, I'll just say this again, I'll read this more cleanly. Evolutionary psychology is a theoretical approach to psychology that attempts to explain useful mental and psychological traits, things like memory, how we perceive things, our use of language, and looking at those things as adaptations, as responses to pressures, selection pressures from our environment, right? So what does selection pressures mean? This is one of the things that's going to be kind of mentioned on in the next video. Again, if you're like well read in evolution and you're you can skip the next video, but again, I don't know why I keep saying that, because I think it's an awesome video. It's one of the better videos I know of for really concisely explaining this concept of what does natural selection mean and what doesn't it mean, right? What it means is that nature, natural, puts everything that's ever born, every biological organism that's born is born into an environment, and that environment is better or worse for certain people, right? So like, let's just give a real specific example. Like, say that there's two dogs, baby dogs, that are born, and one of the baby dogs is better at going a longer time without water, and they're both living in a situation where it's hard to find water. The chances that the one that can go longer without water survives is more likely. It's almost like the natural situation there selected that one dog over the other. That was kind of a freestyle. I don't know if that was the greatest explanation, but that's what natural selection means. That like the nature, just the situation, the environment puts pressure, and some people are better fitted to that very specific pressure. Survival of the fittest, fitted to that pressure, to that selection pressure. Alright, sorry, I know I was just trying to kind of highlight what the kind of meaning of the key terms is and how they interrelate there.
Mechanisms of evolution. What is evolution? Evolution is the development of life on Earth. This is a process that began billions of years ago and is still continuing to this day. Evolution tells us how it was possible for the enormous diversity of life to develop. It shows us how primitive protozoa could become the millions of different species that we see today. Evolution, then, is the answer to the question that we have all asked on seeing a dachshund and a Great Dane together. How is it possible for ancestors to have descendants that look so very different to them? In answering this question, we want to focus on animals, excluding other forms of life such as fungi and plants. The first question to ask is therefore, how can one animal develop into a whole new species of animal? But just a quick question. What exactly is a species? A species is a community of animals that is capable of producing offspring with one another, with those offspring also being capable of reproducing in turn. To understand this answer better, we need to take a closer look at the following points. The uniqueness of living creatures, guaranteed through the excess production of offspring and heredity. And, as a second key point, selection. Let's begin with uniqueness. Every creature that exists is unique. and this is essential for evolution. The members of a species may strongly resemble each other in appearance, however, they all have slightly different traits and characteristics. They may be a bit bigger, fatter, stronger, or bolder than their fellow animals. So what is the reason for these differences? Let's take a closer look at a creature. Every creature is made up of cells. These cells have a nucleus. The nucleus contains the chromosomes, and the chromosomes hold the DNA. DNA consists of different genes, and it's these genes that are life's information carriers. They contain instructions and orders for the cells and determine the characteristics and traits that living creatures have. And it's precisely this DNA that is unique to every creature. It's slightly different from individual to individual, which is why each has slightly different characteristics. But how is the enormous range of DNA created? One key factor is the excess production of offspring. In nature, we can observe that creatures generally produce far more offspring than is necessary for the survival of their species, with many offspring dying an early death as a result. Often there are even more offspring than the environment in which they live is able to support. This is one factor in increasing diversity within a species. The more offspring that are produced, the more little differences occur. And this is what nature wants: as many little differences as possible. The second major cause of the uniqueness of individuals occurs in heredity itself. By the way, heredity means the passing on of DNA to offspring. Two very interesting factors come into play in this process: recombination and mutation. Recombination is the random mixing of the DNA of two creatures. When two creatures fall in love and mate, they recombine their genes twice. The first time they do this separately, when they generate the gametes, that is, sperm and egg cells. The gametes take half of the genes and shuffle them. The second recombination occurs when a male inseminates a female. The parents each provide 50% of their DNA, in other words, 50% of their unique traits and characteristics. These are then recombined or mixed, and the result is new offspring. These offspring have a random mix of the DNA and therefore the traits and characteristics of their parents. This increases the diversity and differences within a species even further. But mutations are also important for evolution. Mutations are random changes in DNA. These can also be described as copying errors within the DNA, triggered by toxins or other chemical substances or by radiation. A mutation exists when a part of the DNA is altered. These changes are often negative and may result in illnesses such as cancer. However, they may also have neutral or positive effects, such as the blue eye color in humans, which is one such random mutation. In all cases, a mutation has to affect a gamete, that is, a sperm or egg cell, because only the DNA in the gametes is passed on to the offspring. This is also the reason why we protect our sexual organs during X-rays, whilst other parts of the body are not at risk. In summary then, in the heredity process, creatures pass on their characteristics to their offspring in the form of DNA. Recombination and mutation change the DNA so that each child looks different to its siblings and receives a random mix of the characteristics of its parents. There's a key word here: random. All of these processes are based on chance. Random recombination and mutations result in individuals with random mixes of traits and characteristics, which in turn mix these randomly and pass them on. But how can so much be down to chance when all living creatures are so perfectly adapted to their environment? For example, the stick insect, the hummingbird, and the frogfish. The answer is provided by the second key point: selection. each individual is subjected to a process of natural selection. As we have learned, each individual is somewhat different to its fellows, and there is extensive variation within a species. Environmental influences have an effect on living creatures. These so-called selection factors include predators, parasites, animals of the same species, toxins, changes in habitat, or the climate. Selection is a process that each individual is subjected to. Every creature has a unique mix of traits and characteristics. This mix helps them to survive in their environment, or not, as the case may be. Anyone with an unsuitable mix will be selected from the environment. Those with the right mix survive and can pass on their enhanced traits and characteristics. This is why diversity is so important. This is why creatures make so much effort to produce offspring that are as different as possible. They increase the likelihood that at least one of their offspring passes nature's selection process. They maximize their chances of survival. A good example of this can be seen in a group of finches living on a remote island. They are some of the most famous animals in the world of science and are known as Darwin finches after their discoverer, Charles Darwin. And this is the story of those finches. A few hundred years ago, a small group of finches was blown onto the Galapagos Islands in the middle of the Pacific, probably by a big storm. The finches found themselves in an environment that was completely new to them, a real finch paradise, an abundance of food, and no predators. They reproduced rapidly and numerously. The islands were soon heaving with finches. This meant that food supplies became increasingly scarce. The finch paradise was threatened with famine, and finch friends became competitors. This is when selection intervened. Their individuality and small differences, in this case their slightly different beaks, meant that some of the birds were able to avoid competing with their fellow finches. The beaks of some of the finches were more suitable for digging for worms. Other finches were able to use their beaks better for cracking seeds. The finches consequently sought out ecological niches. In these niches, they were safe from excessive competition. They soon began to mate primarily with other finches that used the same niche. Over the course of many generations, these characteristics were enhanced, enabling the finches to exploit their niches successfully. The differences between the worm diggers and the seed crackers became so large that they were no longer able to mate with one another. Different species emerged as a result. Today there are 14 different species of finch living on the Galapagos Islands, all of which are descended from the same group of stranded finches. This is how new species are created by evolution, through the interaction of unique individuals, the excess production of offspring, recombination and mutation in heredity, and finally, through selection. Why is this so important? It tells us where the variety of life comes from and why living creatures are so perfectly adapted to their habitats. But it also affects us personally. Every person is the result of 3.5 billion years of evolution. And that includes you. Your ancestors fought and adapted in order to survive. This survival was an extremely uncertain thing. If we consider the fact that 99% of all the species that have ever lived are extinct, then you can consider yourself part of a success story. The dinosaurs have disappeared, but you are alive, watching this video. Because you're incredibly special, just like all the other creatures that exist today. Irreproducible and unique in the universe.
So physically, in terms of physical development in early adulthood, most human beings, and again, this is obviously a massive generalization, but in general, tend to reach physical performance, their peak before 30, usually kind of 19 to 26, and then you start to see decline. And you can kind of see that across, like, say, for example, pro sports. In terms of like muscle tone strength, you usually start to see signs of decline around about age 30. I wanted to show this because this is like a very specific example, right? Like you actually start to see the lens of the eye start to lose some of its like elasticity, its flexibility, and less able to change shape and focus on near objects, which is pretty interesting. Hearing begins to decline in the last part of early adulthood. In the middle to late 20s, fatty tissue increases. Yeah, so it's like, that's like the joke every comedian says, right? It's like as you get into your late 20s and 30s, you just don't kind of get away with the same food choices that you might have got away with a little bit younger because of changes in metabolism, also in just how storage of fatty tissue happens, right? Just these physical changes. So in terms of health in early adulthood, yeah, that's a devastating first point, right? That accidents and suicides are the two leading causes of death between the ages of 15 and 34, and I'm going to assume that a lot of those accidents are going to be automobile related. Right in the, again, the current situation is not helping any of this. And inactivity, diet, obesity, substance use, especially when it gets really out of control, and things like and drinking and stuff like that too. Reproductive health issues, healthcare access is maybe worse, right? Because especially if the person's not on their parents' benefits anymore, but isn't yet working in a full-time scenario where they have their own benefits. Sometimes people in this kind of emerging early adulthood period are in this sort of uninsured time period. Yeah, think about this. Rates of being overweight, obese increases from 25.6% for first year post-secondary students to 32% in fourth year. Right, so, and some of that's going to be things like stress too. Overweight, obesity is linked to things like, hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular issues, and associated with mental health. Hey, same teacher, different day. What's up, my friends? Finished up the PowerPoint on Friday. I have like a all cheerful start, and then I have a difficult point to make. But so substance use is also something that everyone needs to decide how they stand in relation to, and it's something that kind of really rears its head in adolescence and in early adulthood, and especially for young men. And young men are much more likely to develop substance-related addiction than women, statistically. Binge drinking peaks at around 21, 22, and declines later throughout the 20s, and some of that is related to the social changing of the situation, right? When you're around 20, 21, 22 is when you're most likely to have a pretty expanded social world compared to other points in your life. Binge drinking on the rise with Canadian women. Now, of course, I think all of this stuff is on the rise just in general from pandemic-related stuff. The brain undergoes dramatic changes not yet completed by young adulthood, and this may lead to an easier ability to pick up addiction younger, especially in relation to alcohol. Right, alcohol, especially with men, is taking out more men than almost anything. So this is a kind of difficult one because sexuality is a difficult topic to begin with, but also that
it's like there's this difference in how we view males and females and how the social status associated with it, and we view like promiscuity amongst females is like some negative thing, but it's like somehow a positive thing with males, and it's like that's obviously a social construction that is right, and it's like where we know that the psychology on it is clear, right? It's like it doesn't matter what the new Hollywood movie says. It's like casual sexual activity is linked with negative well-being and positively related to psychological distress. So it is related to that, and it's negatively related to well-being. It really doesn't matter what people want that sentence to say. That's what the research shows. And then this like increased likelihood of things when alcohol is involved. Research strongly supports the role of sexuality and well-being. It's not that sexuality or sex is like negative to your mental health. It's actually an important part of human experience, and it's like, but again, it's not even the casualness as much as it's the depth, right? It's like how are you viewing the other person? How are they viewing you? How are you both viewing the situation? And is there respect there? And that's a huge implicator of whether or not there's mental health impact. People want to feel respected, especially in their most intimate times. So this is kind of interesting, right? That as we get older, we move into this more reflective time period, right? And you've heard me mention this a few times, but this is kind of this reflective cycle, or this like planning, and then we learn things, and then we apply that learning, and then we reflect on it, and then we make a new plan, and then we learn things, and then we apply that, and then we reflect on it, and then we make a new plan, and then we learn things. And it's like, I won't do that a million times, but it's like that's kind of the cycle of life, right? It's like back to the drawing board. Some theorize that many individuals consolidate formal operational thinking and planning and hypothesizing in adolescence, and the result is that there's this emergence of for some people, this more systematic, sophisticated level of cognition, this kind of post-formal. It's like you're almost like beyond Piaget's last stage, and again, not assuming everyone gets to it, but this reflective, more relativistic, contextual, like things need to be understood in the situation in which they occur, and in the context, and in the time period, and in relation to all kinds of other variables. That's what provisional means. It like depends on all these other factors. We need to be realistic. We need to recognize the emotional influence on things. And that like a lot of our social experiences are the roots of our learning, this idea of social learning. Okay, so I want to make a quick point here on creativity. I'll just put all the points up here so that I can just rant. So consideration of a declining creativity must take into account the field of creativity involved. So this is an important point, right? So this is kind of like saying that as people get older, they tend to show less creativity across the board, but only across the board, not in specific areas. I might, as I'm getting older, become more articulate and better at writing. And my writing might be getting more and more creative, even though I'm like doing less and less other things that you would classify as creative. So it's just this kind of complexity of it. Creative people regularly experience this idea of flow, or like kind of being absorbed in time. And it's like, I'll be honest, the time that I probably get that the most is when I'm like creating a presentation, and I'm like kind of really into it, and I'm kind of into finding out like how I'm going to set it up, and it's like, and then I'm all of a sudden like, oh man, it's 2 a.m. It's like, because it felt absorbed. Right, this flow combines elements of nature and nurture. It feels good to be in situations that are rewarding, and it's like our dopaminergic system is rewarding us for doing things that we're deeming as valuable and productive. And then also there's the nurture part of it's actually creating tangible influences in our world. So this flow state is very rewarding both internally and externally, because we perform better, so it reaps better reward, but then we also enjoy it more, so it creates an improved internal experience. And that this idea that conscious and unconscious thoughts are essential to creativity is an interesting idea, right? And this is like Carl Jung's idea of shadow work, or this idea of like artistic expression as a route to the unconscious. Active imagination is another thing for you to Google. Active imagination and Carl Jung with a J, J-U-N-G.
Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and that's by the way how you say his name, dedicates a big part of the book to this idea that a person can make himself happy or miserable regardless of what is actually happening outside just by changing the contents of consciousness. And he goes on to quote Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius and Viktor Frankl, so this idea isn't something new. It's been around for millennia now, but recently we've been able to gather more data on it. And I've talked about this idea ad nauseum by now, so I won't go into detail with it. I've talked about it in my videos about meditations and man's search for meaning and many other videos, but to touch on it briefly, people have this idea that if you just had a bigger house, you'd be happy. If you just had a nicer car, you'd be happy. If you just had a lot of money, you'd be happy. But that's just not how happiness works. Here's a graph adjusted for inflation that shows a period of about half a century where personal income tripled, but it didn't really affect how happy people were. After some basic point where your basic needs have been met, buying an even bigger house isn't the way to happiness. It's about changing the contents of your consciousness. So how can we change the contents of our consciousness? One of the best ways to do this is to put ourselves in a state of optimal experience called flow. Csikszentmihalyi describes flow as the state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. He goes on to say that concentration is so intense that there is no attention left over to think about anything irrelevant or to worry about problems. Self-consciousness disappears and the sense of time becomes distorted. And you've probably experienced this before, and it's absolutely one of the best feelings in the world. If you're working on your business, you might be so focused on what you're doing that 12 hours might pass and you have no idea. All of a sudden you look up and you realize you haven't had any food, you haven't thought about anything else. The only thing that you could focus on was your business. And the same thing applies to so many other activities, whether you're a rock climber focused on climbing your new record or a master pianist composing your new masterpiece. It's an amazing feeling. You're so immersed into what you love doing, into what you're really good at, that your brain simply can't focus on other things. You're not worrying about stupid things. You're not regretting what you did yesterday or stressing about what you'll do tomorrow. It's absolutely one of the best feelings in the world. So, if we look at the flow diagram, here's how you put yourself in the state of flow. You don't want what you're doing to be too challenging, otherwise you'll have anxiety. You don't want what you're doing to be too easy for your skills either, otherwise you'll be bored. But it's when you balance these two that you end up in the flow channel. You're striving towards the upper right corner constantly. You increase your challenge, you get better. You get better, you increase your challenge. And the more you move toward that direction, the more intense the state of flow gets. So this is not really a how-to book, but our goal should be to find what it is that we love and then keep getting better at it and keep making it more challenging. Or in other words, the main goal is to spend as much of your life as you possibly can in the state of flow, because that is where you find this unbelievable ecstasy. And Csikszentmihalyi gives an example of the Indians in the Shuswap region of Canada who would settle down in a place filled with resources, and life was good and they had everything they needed. They had all the food and fish where they were, but the elders would make sure that the entire village would just pack up and move to a new location every 25 or 30 years. This way they knew they would have new places to explore and hunt and fish and new challenges to overcome. And it's a great story to keep in mind when you think about how most people just want to settle down in front of their TV for the rest of their lives. And in a lot of my videos, I criticize being in front of the TV all night or spending your entire day on your Facebook feed. And I often get people who tell me, well, what if that makes the person happy? And the answer is, sitting on Facebook all day will not make anyone genuinely happy. If you pick a person who spends his entire day in front of the TV, he's probably not going to be the most exciting, happy, ecstatic person. So let's take a look at the graph again. Looking at your Facebook all day or watching TV puts you in the lower left corner of the graph, which is known as the area of apathy. There's no challenge involved, there's no skill involved, you're apathetic. And when you're not completely apathetic, you're probably sitting there bored or worrying about everything there is to worry about. So move away from that. Move away from the boredom, apathy, and worry, and move towards ecstasy, which is what you'll experience when you hit the state of optimal experience called flow.
there's a whole flood of reasons for why to care about creativity, right? And it's like creativity doesn't mean you all have to go write your own short story fantasy novel, but it does mean that like doing something, whether it's like coloring and drawing, and I actually started getting into coloring because my daughter colors a lot, right? So like this was a couple of years ago, I kind of started getting into like sitting down and coloring with her, and I still do sometimes, and it's like it's a very calming experience. I was never like a big colorer as a kid, and I'm like do more coloring now as an adult. It does reduce stress and anxiety. It does increase positive emotion and decrease depressive symptoms and reduce stress and negative emotion. And it actually helps your immunal functioning in your lymphatic system and increases self-esteem and feelings of accomplishment, helps you have better attention and concentration and focus. It makes you feel more emotionally content and happy. It's like those are what a list of benefits, right? Like what a holistic list of benefits that is. So just a couple points about often the other aspect of early adulthood is this push towards career, and that earning a living or choosing an occupation, establishing a career, developing a career, these are important parts of kind of establishing a sense of who you are and a sense of what your purpose and role is in life as an adult, and that a lot of people really struggle when they don't feel that their life has a specific purpose or focus or vision or intention. Right, and this is why this purpose, it says that purpose is a missing ingredient in many adolescents and in emerging adults. Too often students focus on short-term goals and aren't focused on kind of the big or long-term picture of like, who are you trying to be and what do you want to be and what kind of life do you want to have and what kind of relationships do you want to have and what do you want your self-talk to be like. And work can define people in ways and has this huge influence on things like identity and adds structure. And without work and without routine, most people do worse. Human beings tend to perform best when there's a consistency to our routine. So one of the last points I want to make here is about stress and this idea that like stress is an important consideration in regards to professional work, and a lot of people nowadays are really valuing things like jobs that allow them to perform but also have greater flexibility. Like even like this job for me, right? Like teaching at Nipissing, one of the reasons I'm able to do it is because I can make the recordings like at night and on the weekends and stuff, and it's like I work a 44-hour week full-time job, right, too, right? So it's like, and whatever, that's just my own personal scenario, but I mean the ability to have some flexibility with, say for example, when I make my Nipissing lectures allows me to do it, and then all of a sudden I can like fit it into my life and it's cool. Think about that last point is really interesting, that kids that have low self-control tend to struggle in work scenarios when they're 20. So that's really interesting, right? Because that's like kind of saying that there's like this predictive ability to even look at like how much kids are able to kind of have task persistence and stay focused as kids affects things later, which is an interesting example of consistency. You've now reached the last section of the presentation, the last 3 slides, where I do my quick, incredible Professor Mainland lightning rounds. That sounded lame. Okay, number 1, emerging adulthood. The time of transition from adulthood to adulthood is characterized by experimentation and exploration as you're trying to figure out who you are and how you fit into the world. The transition from high school to post-secondary school, so like university or college, can involve both positive and negative features, right? You're trying to, it's this exciting time where there's also all these new stresses. A benchmark or a key part of emerging adulthood is this pressure to find your purpose. We see that peak physical performance is often reached between the years of 19 and 26. This is towards the later part of early adulthood. There's this detectable slowdown in physical performance. That's saying it lightly. Number 5, health problems in emerging and young adulthood include things like obesity, a serious problem in North America, often also include things like alcohol and drug issues. Sexuality becomes a major part in adolescence, we talked about.
an individual's sexual preferences, because that's a really interesting thing. Like who you find attractive and who you don't is actually a really complicated combination of, well, genetic, hormonal, cognitive, and environmental factors. I don't think I touched on this, but this is another point. Sexually transmitted infections, or STIs, are contracted primarily through sexual contact. I don't know why I thought I had to say that. I think that's kind of obvious. And then the last slide. Okay, it's been proposed that the idealism of the formal operation stage declines in young adulthoods, and this idea of this more realistic or pragmatic, which means like sort of realistic or practical way of thinking. Pragmatists are thinking of what's practical. It's like the kind of philosophy school of William James. A qualitatively different fifth cognitive stage called post-formal thought has been proposed. Social learning plays a key role in cognitive development, and that work defines people in fundamental ways and is a key aspect of their identity. Working through college or university can have positive outcomes, but can also have negative impacts on grades. I love you. See you next week in Chapter 10, where we look at the social and emotional aspects of adulthood. Cheers.